Okay, Barry?
Okay, should I go?
Yeah.
You ready, Ruth?
Mhm.
Okay. All right, they can hear me now, I hope. Welcome to our Preventing Overdiagnosis online seminar with David Ropeik. David is a retired Harvard instructor, author, and authority in risk communication. He taught risk communication at the Harvard School of Public Health and also critical thinking about environmental issues in the Harvard School of Continuing Education. He's widely published in both the general and academic press on risk issues and risk perception. He's author of Curing Cancer Phobia: How Risk, Fear, and Worry Mislead Us. I have a copy of the book here. I've read it, learned a lot from it, and can highly recommend it. He also wrote the book, How Risky Is It Really? Why Our Fears Don't Always Match the Facts, and is co-author of Risk, a practical guide for deciding what's really safe and what's really dangerous in the world around you. From 1978 to 2000, David was a TV reporter on WCVB in Boston, twice winning the DuPont Columbia Award, often referred to as the Pulitzer Prize of Broadcast Journalism, as well as 4 Emmy Awards. He was a founding member of the board of directors of the Society of Environmental Journalists. This session is the 2024 kickoff of the Preventing Overdiagnosis online series of seminars. And we're fortunate to have the opportunity to tap into David's wealth of knowledge, experience, and insights into why cancer is our most feared disease. I thank him for accepting our invitation to speak. I also want to thank my session co-chair, Stephen Wolishin, who will be monitoring the chat in today's seminar. Please type your questions and comments in the Q&A board link. David's presentation will be about 30 minutes, followed by open discussion based on your questions for the remainder of the hour. Finally, many thanks to Ruth Davis at Oxford, who set up this session along with Joanna Locke. As always, their help has been critical to the success of Preventing Overdiagnosis conferences. David?
Well, thank you, Dr. Kramer, and good morning or afternoon or wherever you are. Good day to all of you. Hi. Thank you, Dr. Kramer and Steve Wolishin and the steering committee for this invitation, and the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford for facilitating things. I must say I had mixed feelings, not about accepting the invitation, but about doing it by Zoom. Oxford's a really beautiful place, but then all the British detective shows that I watch have people dying there left and right, so maybe Zoom is the safest. In any event, I am excited. I'm not just a little bit daunted because, as Dr. Kramer suggested, I am not an academic, I'm not a researcher, I'm not an MD. My background is in journalism and synthesizing the knowledge from other fields and presenting that information to people. And that's how I come about presenting what I hope will be helpful to you. I spent 15 years at the Harvard School of Public Health and the program on continuing education, during which time I focused on bringing to public attention what I call the risk perception gap. Let me say that phrase again, the risk perception gap. And by that, what I mean is when we fear things more than we need to or less than we should, and the gap becomes a risk in and of itself. And that is in essence what we'll be talking about today. The idea is that if we recognize that gap, that our subjective risk perception system leads to gaps between our fears and the facts, if we recognize that gap and understand its psychology, we can try to reduce its harms more effectively. The goal of this talk is to help the Preventing Overdiagnosis movement in its goal of winding back the harms of too much medicine by understanding some of the underlying psychology that explains why cancer is our most feared disease. And by understanding that psychology, we can hopefully develop ways to shape what is called the choice architecture, the choice environment. This is a phrase that's used by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein and other people in the cognitive science field, the behavioral economics field, the choice environment in which people choose whether to screen and what to do about a diagnosis of an overdiagnosed cancer. And that leads me to explain briefly why I wrote the book and how I come to be connected to the movement. In 2013, when I read about the first conference at Dartmouth, I thought, well, I'll go to that because, you know, people's emotions must have a role in this overdiagnosis issue. And while I learned a lot at Dartmouth, I was surprised to find that there was very little work that was concentrating on the emotions and the psychology of people's choices about cancer. So that encouraged me to go forward with what I've been thinking about already, which is writing this book, Curing Cancer Phobia, How Risk, Fear, and Worry Mislead Us, and to bring the issue to greater attention. And that leads me to today. But a couple caveats before I get into the substance. First, I apologize. I apologize in advance to anyone who has been touched by the cruelty of cancer, as many of us have, as I have, who finds it offensive to suggest that our fear of this disease might be a phobia. That can sound offensive. That does, to many people, sound offensive. But here are my qualifications on that claim. I'm only talking at the 30,000 foot level. I'm only talking population-wide. I don't dare question as right or wrong, rational or irrational, anyone's personal choices about whether to screen, what to do about an overdiagnosed cancer, or anything else in the cancer experience. That's none of my business. It's too personal. It can only be a choice made in the context of people's personal lives, and it's right for them and not for anyone outside that to judge, and I don't. So I'm only talking at the 30,000 foot level. And the other caveat is, as I've said, I only look at two critical issues for the Preventing Overdiagnosis movement, which is, should I screen, the choice about screening, which sets off the medical cascade that can lead to overdiagnosis and overtreatment, and the choices we make about how to respond to a diagnosis of an overdiagnosed disease. The complications and the hellish emotional reality inside the rest of the cancer experience is way more complicated and way more personal than I dare touch on. I don't. So I'm only talking about those two fields. So now let me bring up my slides and offer you a little bit more content than that preface alone. Let's see. Share screen. There's a screen. Here's some slides. Here's I got to push all my buttons. Oop, hang on a second. Sorry. Dancing around. There it is. Is that good? Barry, you seen the whole slide kit?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So we talked to the organizers about whether I have any conflicts of interest. I don't. Nobody paid me to do this, but I will be talking about my book, and I hope you buy my book. But that's the extent of whether I have any conflict of interest. This is a slide from the American Cancer Society in the 1930s. It was actually the American Society for the Control of Cancer originally. And look at what's at the top, fear. It's important to understand that the idea of cancer phobia, which word I employ, is not mine, is not new. First mentioned, as best I can find it, in the New England Journal of Medicine, an unwarranted phobia in 1928. And we'll talk a little bit about the history in just a moment. Dr. John Ryle in the Maudsley Lectures in 1948 said, in Great British Dryness, This fear may assist the perpetuation of much unhappiness and physical and mental illness. Yeah, yep. And Dr. George Kreil, who I was really impressed a lot by in reading his book, Cancer and Common Sense, in 1951, Dr. Kreil, turns out, was Rachel Carson's oncologist after she fired the first 2 breast cancer doctors for not being honest with her about what she had. They wouldn't use the C word. Late 1950s this was, turns out. She hired Kreil because he was more honest about things. Well, he said in Cancer and Common Sense and a lot of other writing that he did, that the fear of this disease has been beaten into us until it's become almost as great an enemy as the disease itself. That's 1951. So this idea that the fear of cancer has been dangerous all by itself goes back a ways. Now, to understand how we've come to our feelings about cancer today, it's important to start with a little bit of history. So in 1900, cancer was only the 8th leading cause of death. And that's mostly because we didn't live long enough for all the mutations in our DNA that allow for uncontrolled cell growth to build up, which starts to really kind of show up in people who are 50, 55 and older. We didn't get there until the 1910s and 20s in the richer countries in the world, I should carefully add. So it wasn't until the 1930s that it had become the 2nd leading cause of death. And at the same time, the leading cause of death, tuberculosis, had gone down. It was interesting that tuberculosis was called the white knight of death and feared for the same reasons that cancer is today in part. A diagnosis of tuberculosis was a death sentence originally, but by this point in history, tuberculosis treatment was now helping save some lives. Meanwhile, cancer was going up and there was nothing you could do. Cancer killed. And so deaths were everywhere suddenly and exploding in our personal experience. And erupting around that was, oh my God, that could happen to me, fear, or has happened to my loved ones. So from the 1920s on, there was increasing news coverage of cancer, and they would use the C word. Till then, they didn't use it. It was a stigmatized word. It was almost like an oath, a dirty word. There were alarmist news stories. There were public education campaigns by the American Society for Control of Cancer and other groups, although those things didn't reach many people. But what did was the heavy marketing of quack cures. We talk about those things today, you know, people offering products that can protect you from getting cancer, but it was humongous back then because doctors weren't particularly respected by that point. They didn't have the aura of our experts to go to for our health back then. So people were looking for all kinds of cures, and the quack cure industry fed on and fueled the fear of cancer hugely. Let's fast forward now to the post-World War II. Soldiers start coming home, and they'd been giving cigarettes like candy for a lot of reasons. And now they were dropping like flies from lung cancer. And that started what erupted through the 50s and 60s. Does smoking cause cancer? Now, remember, back then, most people smoked. So there was a direct, am I going to die, attention paid to this one controversy. That hugely ramped up the oh my godness, the fear of the disease. At the same time, Mary Lasker, a society woman who had a lot of connections with the public relations industry and the movie industry, had taken over the American Society for Control of Cancer and turned it into the ACS, which did a lot more movies and fear promotion campaigns and drama. The Jimmy Fund, that young boy who was on a radio program and members of the Red Sox came into his room as a national radio audience listened and cried and surprised the boy. Jimmy was one of the first survivors of childhood leukemia under Dr. Sidney Farber's care at what became the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, which was a ray of hope. We could now treat cancer without surgery, but with chemicals. So the Jimmy Fund and a lot of other things were Mary Lasker's PR campaign that dramatically raised the fear of cancer in order to get federal spending to combat the disease, to cure the disease, to eliminate the disease, not just to educate the public. And that led to the second National Cancer Act in 1972, the preamble of which said, We passed this because this is the disease of most concern to the public. It had already become the disease we feared more than heart disease, which back then and still kills more people in most of the world. At the same time all of that was happening, modern environmentalism was getting going. Now that started out of fear of nuclear war, the atomic weapons of World War II, and then the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons and the indiscriminate fallout of radioactive, the fallout of radioactive fallout. That was the beginning of the modern environmental movement. Then Rachel Carson and other people came along and broadened it to the indiscriminate fallout of pesticides and other chemicals. So that's the root of where we are today, which is that most people still believe that most cancer is caused by environmental carcinogens. They know there are other causes, but as we'll see later in our talk, the environmental carcinogen part is still a huge fear, and it has this historic root, and it's worth noting that when we talk about the psychology in just a minute. And finally, in this history, I think it's really important that early on, in order to raise the funds necessary for a federal program to cure the disease, the promise was, we will cure cancer. Now, we knew then, and we certainly know now, that that basically means undoing the basic biology of the way humans make copies of their cells, which lead to the mutations that contribute to cancer. We can't cure the whole disease in this blanket way that's been promised. The problem is, with this promise, it's been unfulfilled. And so we still think we haven't gotten there. And so all the progress we have made isn't enough, isn't satisfactory. We're still working on moonshots, from Kennedy to Obama to Biden invoking moonshot. The promise is up here. The reality is down here. The reality is mortality is way down in the US and a lot of other places compared to 30 years ago, but it's still not where we've been promised. So that's a bunch of history, and I think it's an important foundation. And it leads to these three beliefs that are now not completely true and don't match the facts and are a phobia, in my opinion. Cancer always kills is just wrong. More than half, as many as 2/3 of cancers can be treated as chronic diseases or cured outright, as doctors call it, put into remission. Screening and finding cancer as early as possible, an absolute fundamental belief since the American Society for Control of Cancer, 1913, is also not completely true. We find cancers now that scare us into doing more than we need. And this third belief that environmental carcinogens are a major cause of our cancer, that has never been true. And it's still a deep public belief. Let me get now to the psychology. I will be citing the work of people from which I've learned. This is a synthesis of the work of the psychometric paradigm research of Paul Slovic and Baruch Fischoff and Sarah Lichtenstein and many others, the cognitive science and heuristics and biases research of Daniel Kahneman and many, many, many others. And finally, research on cancer fear that I found in researching the book by Charlotte Vrinton, now at Imperial College working on other things, and Jane Wardle, a brilliant leader in this research field who unfortunately passed away from cancer while I was writing the book. Those women and others, their colleagues, asked people, what do you fear about cancer, in essence? And it kind of confirmed the findings from the psychometric paradigm and the heuristics and biases. It was proof of concept in the real world of what that research had found. These are the 5 factors that I'll go over in detail in just a minute, but I just wanted to put this slide up so that you can consider them. These are, you can call them risk perception factors, you can call them psychological characteristics. These are subconscious is really important, automatic filters that we use to gauge whether something is more or less scary. We don't have the time, we don't have the expertise, we don't have the knowledge to completely, fully have all the facts on everything. And even if we did, there's the context of our own lives to layer on top of that. So our risk perception is subjective. inescapably subjective. To say that we should only do this with the facts, and once they understand the facts, that's enough, is naive. It's naive. I can't say that enough. It's naive to hope that the facts alone will do the job of encouraging a healthy, optimal choice. So these 5 filters, which I'll explain now, are some of the filters through which we see the facts. Okay? Think of them like a stained glass window, crude metaphor, but there's light on the outside and it looks red to us because we're seeing it through a piece of red glass. Simple, crude metaphor. So let's talk about control. We are more afraid of any threat to us if we can't do anything about it, if we're powerless. Look at what Angelina Jolie said when she announced that she'd had her double mastectomy. The fear produces a deep sense of powerlessness. I can't do anything about it. Makes any risk scarier. Well, now think about the choice about whether to screen. Lots of research confirms that people believe deeply in screening, as Steve and Lisa and a lot of people have done, because it gives me something I can do. It makes me feel, again, to use a crude, non-academic metaphor, like my hands now are on the steering wheel of this experience. I'm doing something. Screening is empowerment and seductive because of that, right? The facts about screening, the pros and cons, bump up against, yeah, but cancer will kill me, so screening is the one thing I can do. Also think about the person who's diagnosed with an overdiagnosed cancer. The doctor will say, this is a really low risk disease, and we could just monitor it. Although with breast cancer, they have to recommend surgery. That's the standard of care, as I understand it. But, you know, it's a really low risk disease. Don't really worry about it. But people hear the C word. This is the whole debate about the semantics of diagnostic language, right? And doing something, control, feels more fulfilled when you take it all out than if you just sit there and watch and wait. Watchful waiting and active surveillance are active treatment. They are taking control. We could do a better job of impressing people that it is an active way of taking control, but it doesn't feel like it. So that leads to those choices. And there's a final point that I wanted to make about control here. There's a whole problem that overdiagnosis, preventing overdiagnosis doesn't really focus on, but I think needs to be mentioned because it bears out the psychology here. Some people take control of their fear of cancer by not facing it. They are at a high risk, genetically, you know, for other reasons, racially, whatever, or they're just in the age groups for which screening is recommended, but they don't screen. And they say they don't screen, among many reasons. They don't want to know. They don't want to hear those words. You have cancer, the fear of that. And there are people who delay presenting for cancer. Dr. Joseph DeVita Jr., who used to run the National Cancer Institute, talks about delay in presenting for what turned out to be prostate cancer because he didn't want to hear the words, you have cancer. This is a person who completely understood all of the facts better than most of us. Delayed presenting and had a slightly more advanced case when he finally needed to be treated. There was a survey that was recently done in England that found that 2 people in 5 said, if I had symptoms that might be cancer, I would delay seeing a doctor because I don't want to hear the words, you have cancer. They didn't say it in precisely that word. That wasn't the question that was asked, but that was the gist of it. And 1 in 4 people said, I'd wait and see if the symptoms went away on their own. 1 in 4, our most feared disease. The fear is that powerful. I call that a risk perception gap. Let me move on. The psychometric paradigm literature calls this factor dread. I have asked Paul for permission to call it more simply pain and suffering. And the short of this factor is the nature of how you die matters more than the statistical likelihood that you will. Listen to that. The nature of how you die matters more emotionally and shapes our choices more than the statistical information about the likelihood of death. Now think about that in terms of preventing overdiagnosis. Doctors present information in statistical terms all the time. It doesn't matter what the statistics say or how well you understand them. I'm sorry, let me qualify that. Of course, it matters whether you understand the statistics and the numeric information, but what matters more is how it feels. So would you rather be eaten alive by a shark or burned to death or die of heart disease? People usually said rather die of heart disease. The likelihood there is heart disease, but we're much more afraid of the things that would kill us in awful ways. Well, you can read all these quotes. I don't have to read them to you, but it confirms this factor. More painful than it needs to be, horrified the imagination, death in its worst forms, slow and miserable, dread, pain and suffering. A third factor, personification. Think about the risk of climate change. It's very interesting that the surveys on climate change, people say, I believe in it and it's serious and I feel threatened. And then if you really probe the emotions and you ask them a key question, could it happen to you? The fear goes down because it's an idea. Climate change is not a face, a name, something like what I see in the mirror. Cancer is. We all know cancer through the personal experience that we've had in our families, ourselves, our loved ones, or even if not in ourselves, through Princess Kate or the King or Francis Collins or Olivia Munn or the local high school football player whose story is in the news. It's a person, and we see a risk that is like us in more fearful terms than an idea. And personification becomes, therefore, something that we can use to talk about the choices about screening and how to handle an overdiagnosed disease, as we'll see in better risk communication as one of the ways to use this information to advance the winding back the harms of too much medicine. And you can see these quotes, and I needn't read the slide for you. Another factor is the risk imposed on us or is it voluntary? And the best way to describe this one is, here's Rachel Carson's quote again from Silent Spring. Against these carcinogens, which his own activities had created, man is doing it to us. The risk of environmental carcinogens is imposed on us. The risks we take of heart disease, we think, are voluntary. I drink too much beer, I eat my French fries, I sit on the couch and binge TV, play with my computer, lifestyle things. Well, of course, as we know, lifestyle choices are just as critical for reducing the risk of cancer and far more so than reducing our risk from environmental carcinogens. But that's not the perception. The perception is environmental carcinogens are more likely to cause cancer. And you can see all those data on the bottom from a survey from the American Society of Clinical Oncologists. 6 of the top 10 what causes cancer were imposed on us. Industrial things, a la Rachel Carson. And the voluntary stuff, which was on the list, alcohol, bad diet, overweight, lower on the list. So a risk that feels imposed, as cancer does, scares us more. And finally, is it human-made or natural? This is a corollary to the previous one. And here's again Carson. Man alone of all forms of life, she wrote, can create cancer-producing substances. Well, she was a marine biologist. She was a scientist. She should have known better. She did know better. But she was promoting this idea that humans were screwing up the environment. So she emphasized this. It's human-made. And look at this headline. This was in the Telegraph. And it was written by the science reporter, although this is the headline and the reporter never writes the headline. But the story was, cancer is caused by modern man, as it was virtually non-existent in the ancient world. Cancer is a modern man-made disease, study suggests. Well, the study was written by advocacy scientists. We all know that problem. Scientists who use their science and their degrees to make a case that they believe. The first case of cancer that we know of, which the science reporter for the Telegraph should have known or could have known in 2010 by looking it up very quickly, was in a pre-human hominid 1.7 million years ago. There was plenty of cancer back then. There just wasn't as much of it because we didn't live long enough. That's just wrong, but it is part of these beliefs that we have. So to close out this cognitive section and get to the end of my talk here, from the heuristics and biases literature, the cognitive sciences literature, the how we think fast and slow, as Kahneman's book called it, literature, there are these factors that also contribute to our cancer phobia, in my opinion. There's availability. So when the brain, when you experience something that has deep meaning to you, fear, love, whatever, the brain encodes that in a way that makes it come more quickly back into available consciousness because that was such a meaningful experience. This is great for fear, right? So if 2 days ago you were taking a walk and you saw a snake on the ground and you jumped back, you want to remember that spot, and you will remember it more quickly than you'll remember that something you were driving by on the way to that walk that didn't have any emotional valence. So availability, boy, cancer is, you say cancer, the brain floods with all sorts of emotionally powerful experience. So availability is one. Awareness is a corollary. Think here too of a crude, non-academic, but a metaphor. We have so much space on our awareness radar screen. I go like this, radar screen. And so there are blips about what's in the news and what are people talking about, and what happened to me and my family. And the bigger the blip is, the more it's gonna have a voice in what we're paying attention to. Roger Kasperson and colleagues called this the social amplification of risk, where higher awareness of something gives it more emotional power, and the amplification of risk creates risks all by itself, not from the cancer, but from awareness of. When everybody's talking about something, our fear of it goes up. There are loss and regret aversion. Loss aversion basically means the prospect of loss carries more emotional weight than the prospect of gain. Cancer is about the prospect of loss. Regret aversion means, as I'm deciding what to do about an overdiagnosed cancer that the doctor has said is low risk, I don't want to get out 10 years from now and have cancer and think, I regret my decision. So as we're making decisions, we subconsciously say to ourselves, I don't want to regret that decision, so I'm going to be overcautious in this case now. Interestingly, the research suggests that while many people do have more treatment than their clinical conditions require, and regret the man living in diapers with no erectile function, the woman with a changed body shape and post-mastectomy pain syndrome, regret doing too much. We read about those stories in the paper, and the Preventing Overdiagnosis movement, I think, contributes to this. Most people don't regret their decision, even though they're suffering side effects, in part because of regret aversion. We don't want to live with the uncomfortableness of, I chose wrong. So they talk themselves into being comfortable with their choice. And finally, there's the issue of innumeracy, which Steve and Lisa and Gerd Gigerenzer and Ellen Peters and so many have written about and researched. We don't understand numbers well. A lot of work has been done to help people understand numbers better. But a caution again, if we understand the numbers well, 1 in a million is still too high if the one could be me. Yeah. So 2 quick slides about to start a discussion here about how to use this. So I propose that we could use some of these ideas in better risk communication at various stages in dealing with the public or individual patients. We can communicate that choices about lifestyle and diet to reduce your risk of cancer are taking control. You are empowering yourself against cancer by eating well and exercising and so forth. We can frame those choices to emphasize with the words control and empowerment and all of that language to raise up that part of the emotional seesaw as people are considering choices about screening and about lifestyle and diet, and also ongoing monitoring versus active aggressive surgery. Yeah. While you're monitoring, you're going to the doctor for another PSA test. You're going to the doctor for another biopsy, let's say, for PSA. You're going more regularly for mammograms because you have dense breasts, let's say. You are taking control. That language can emphasize that side of those choices and wind back the harms of too much medicine. We can use loss aversion and regret aversion by talking more dramatically than most doctors do about the side effects. I've been through a lot of medical experiences. The doctors talk about the benefit of the treatment and kind of slide in a little bit about the risk. That's misleading, in my opinion. And I've told doctors that, and I tell them that I've studied risk communication and I know the law, and their eyes widen. Yeah. But we should emphasize, because of the subconscious filters of loss aversion and risk aversion, regret aversion, the downsides of those choices. And as I said, we can use personification to add impact by personifying not only the survivors of cancer, right? There should be more of those stories, but the people who have suffered from more clinical treatment than they need. Last slide, finally done. The personification I just mentioned. I think there needs to be much more a broad and balanced communication about screening's modest benefits. I was surprised to learn about those modest benefits and their significant harms. And in this particular one, I would be very specific. I think the medical community should be shamed by louder voices saying they're lying to the public, they're deceiving the public by overselling the benefits of screening and all but hiding the harms. The leading cancer hospitals in the country are in this coalition, and they just put out a 51-page paper to help women make choices about mammography. There is not a word about the downsides of mammography. I mean, I think they maybe mention false positives, but the cascades that mammography can lead to, its minimum benefits, hidden. These are the best cancer hospitals in the country. I think the medical community is vulnerable to being shamed for being misleading about the risks and benefits of screening. I think we should require more informed consent with screening choices. I know when I've gone in for surgery, I have to sign these forms for the doctor. He's told me about the risks, and the anesthesiologist. Nobody ever has done that for me for any kind of screening. That doesn't happen with PSA testing. It doesn't happen with mammography. We could build it into the system so it's required as a step that will save money, ergo insurers should love it, which means that doctors will have time to do it. This is not only informed consent, but these are the use of decision aids and that whole field, which Preventing Overdiagnosis is also worked on. That will help people make healthier choices, probably wind back the harms of too much medicine, save money. It is in the interest of insurers to encourage this be built into the system more. And the last point, and I'll finally shut up, I'm sorry, a little long. The numbers of people harmed by overtreatment are stunning. I crudely estimated them in my book, but I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. I didn't do it in a way that could be published in JAMA or BMJ or anywhere. But my crude calculations are stunning. Tens of thousands of men a year left with serious side effects. Erectile dysfunction, urinary incontinence, from prostatectomies they really didn't need. Several thousand women a year left with lifelong post-mastectomy pain syndrome from mastectomies they didn't need. For low-grade DCIS, not even the medium and high grade, I eliminated them, okay? People die from overtreatment. The overtreatment of overdiagnosed cancer in the United States costs the system, crudely, $5.3 billion a year. 3% of all the money that's spent on cancer care in America is spent treating cancers that clinically don't require that treatment. Those numbers, done by people like you, with more persuasive and powerful, thorough research, would carry an awful lot of weight to raise the conversation about cancer versus overtreatment, the seesaw. Doctors don't want to take the C word out of diagnoses because they don't want to miss one cancer that might have been not treated by a person who's just watchfully waiting. So they want that scary word to be in the diagnosis. But they're overweighting that cancer death, that's their personal experience, and underweighting the harms of overtreatment. Give those numbers, make those numbers more dramatically and widely known, and I think that can do an awful lot towards the goal of all of this. Forgive me for taking 10 extra minutes. I run on at the mount some. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go back into discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Woloshin and you for the open Q&A. Stephen?
Great. Can you hear me, Barry?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much, David, for your talk. We'll have time now for some questions. I want to just start by asking Barry if you have any questions that you'd like to ask.
No, I have a little bit of a comment that maybe David can talk about that gets to the issue of this sense that, you know, there's some nefarious cause out there in the environment that's causing cancer when researchers at Hopkins have estimated that most cancers are actually simply what they refer to as bad luck.
Yeah, Bert Vogelstein and Tomasetti and those people, yes.
Exactly.
But you know, that whole thing was discussed a lot in the press, and the doctors who are on the side of we need to pay more attention to the environmental carcinogens said, oh no, that's going to make people less worried about this, and they fought against that. So in the public discussion of those numbers, I think it was like 2/3 to 1/3 natural to environment. It got manipulated by advocates on both sides, if you will, to keep the fear high. And I watched a lot of the press coverage of it. I used to be part of this sort of press coverage. Yeah, but environmental carcinogens, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And that got promoted too, despite what the science says.
Right. And so as a matter of fact, maybe bad luck was a poor choice of a phrase, but it invited open attacks on the phrase, not on the underlying science.
This is the risk communication challenge of knowing how people are going to receive information through these emotional filters and thinking that through as you make these choices, which of course scientists and academics don't do mostly either, because they can be accused of being manipulative as they do so, which is interesting because in this particular case, the side that promoted fear of environmental carcinogens weren't shy about using that kind of language at all, alarmist language.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you, Barry. Thank you, David. For the people in the audience, please post your questions. In the meantime, I have a question for you, David. During the time that you wrote this book, there's been some new developments, technological developments that I think have had a really important effect on the communication of information about risks and benefits of cancer. And I was wondering if you could talk, there are two in particular. One is the development of new technologies like the multi-cancer early detection tests, these blood tests that, you know, supposedly will detect all sorts of cancers. Also the use of things like total body, MRI kind of screening tests. And related to that is this other technology, which is the development of the influencers. So there are people like Kim Kardashian who's promoting MRI, total body MRI testing and stuff. And I think that's a critically important issue. It's changing or amplifying or putting these issues that you've discussed on steroids. So I'm wondering, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about these things.
As to the new screening technologies, they are just the more modern version of we're going to 3D, you know, mammography instead of 2D, et cetera. All of them are answering the public's desire to take more control over cancer by having more ways of finding it as early as possible. And the public has hungrily demanded these things. The story of the approval of mammography and PSA both give a great warning story against the MCEDs, the blood tests, the multiple cancer early detection tests. Both mammography and PSA testing were approved for public use without full science measuring their benefits or whether there are any harms. They were approved, and the FDA hearings are scary to read, under public pressure. We want them, we want them, we want them, we want them. Mammography had come out and the PSA testing was available for people who are already in the prostate cancer experience. Is their PSA up or down? Did we get all the cells and so forth? And men went to the FDA and said, we want one too. There was a public group, Steve, that was called Us Too, demanding the PSA test. Us Too, they got one. Women have one. The ribbon for prostate cancer was blue. They have their own ribbon. They had a pink ribbon. We want one too. The demand for this is so high that it makes regulators really challenged for being careful. So the MSED specifically, as I've read stuff about it, detect pieces of cells that are floating around and even can tell you what organ they came from, but they can't yet tell what most cancer diagnostics can tell. Not what it is, but what it's going to do. The way the Gleason score kind of indicates for prostate cancer, and OncoDX kind of a little bit does for breast cancer. So we find it, we add the C word to people's fears, and the whole body testing is, oh my God, the same with incidentalomas. We could a whole body screen everybody and find a shadow that would scare people somewhere, right? That's how we find a lot of thyroid cancer now, not screening for thyroid, but for chest and neck and head, and oops, there's a shadow over there, and you're off to the races. So all of these things emotionally satisfy the public's fears and demands. And then to get to the second part of your question, we are in a social media era where all kinds of voices say, yeah, you should. And we trust. Trust is a really important part of the risk perception formula when you're talking about communication. So doctors are our most trusted profession. But our trust instincts actually, it turns out, predominantly depend on who we judge is on our side, right? As social animals, if the lion's attacking, we need to know that everybody in the tribe is going to help fight the lion. A very crude metaphor again, right? So we're constantly very sensitively screening for who's on our side. Politics, what's their agenda, not just politics. Dr. Mercola sells all of this hokey stuff, right? But he's on the side of people who believe, many of my friends, quite frankly, natural, good for you, right? So there are influencers and just regular social media voices and the media, all of whom come across as more or less on our side. And that magnifies what I was talking about at first, the general desire for more screening to help us. And that makes it really hard for regulators to do what the scientific evidence suggests is best.
Great, well, thank you. So I think there are a few people who have their hands up, but the way to ask questions is to do it through Vivox. So if you do that, then we'll be able to see your questions, and then I can read them for David to answer. So so please use Vivox.
And while you're typing and using Vivox, I should tell you that Barry and Steve and Ruth and Joanna, her colleague at Oxford, practiced this several times, and we too struggle to get the technology smooth. So as you're doing the same thing, we empathize.
All right, so we're just waiting for these questions to come through. And while we're waiting, maybe just back to about the influencer issue. You mentioned something about regulators, but I'm not sure that regulators are the answer here, because it's hard to see. The influencers have their right to say what they want, and they can say things that are right or wrong. But I think the real problem is helping the public, preparing the public to be on the receiving end of messages, to be more critical thinkers, and that seems to be a really tough issue. And I know your book is an attempt to do that. I'm wondering, what else can we do to make the public smarter so that they aren't as vulnerable to being manipulated by influencer or other messages?
There are two parts to that answer, and I've had this discussion about a lot of risks. You used an interesting word, make the public smarter. And your work on innumeracy embodies this, and I applaud it. It's awesome, very helpful. But smarter implies more evidence-based, more critical thinking, more fact-based, more rational. You can use a lot of words, and there's semantic shadings to all of them. And the problem with that, the limitation, yes, we should shoot for all of that, and there are ways to do that, and I'll discuss them in just a moment. But first, you have to understand that we're still going to be looking at all of that information through the lenses of how that information feels. We can't not do that. Antonio Damasio he's a neuroscientist, wrote a fabulous book called Descartes' Error. I think, therefore I am. Yeah. He studied a guy named HM or somebody like that who had had surgery that separated his prefrontal cortex from his limbic system, the emotional system, to save his life from epilepsy seizures. His life was in ruins. He could pass all the intellectual tests. He couldn't make a single choice, Stephen. He couldn't make a single choice about what time to make a dentist's appointment, about a job, about how to treat people. His life was in ruins because the facts, which he could do perfectly in all the tests, had no emotional valence. The facts part of his brain couldn't talk to the emotional part of the brain. And I go into those details to impress upon you how absolutely biological it is, built into us, that we do our critical thinking through the filters of these psychological factors. And we need to understand them too. Now, to get to your other question, you can be an influencer. You are. Barry can be one. I tried to be with my book. I'm not Kim Kardashian influencer, but why not find people? Well, thank God. Why not play that? Not to play that game. That's a crude way to put it. Add these voices, find the stars and the so forth that can add this part of the conversation to the public's who do I trust conversation. We can also, and you've done this, Stephen, and I've tried to do it a little bit, and Barry, you may have, work with the news media to help them understand these issues better, to help them understand also that they do harm by over-alarming people. It's interesting, newsrooms have, in my experience, policies where they won't cover, a TV station won't cover a live guy about to jump off a building because they're afraid of copycats. Yeah. If we hear about a crime if we heard about a crime that was coming up, we'd call the police first instead of set the camera up across the street from the bank. Yeah. We have do no harm policies. I met with lots of editors during my time at Harvard when the H word allowed me to meet with them, and tried to impress upon them that alarming the public unduly based on what the evidence says causes harm every bit as directly. So there are ways to become more influential in the public conversation, both through the media and as influencers, that I think in the social media world can shape the filters that people see this information through a little. But as I say in all of my writing, we can neither cure cancer entirely, given its biological nature, nor can we cure these fears. But we can add this conversation about risks and benefits to a lot more of people's thinking and wind back the harms that some of their choices lead to.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions now that are coming through on Vivox. The first one is, I'll just read it to you. Thank you for a very interesting talk. You argue that emotion and psychology are very important in explaining cancer fear. Is psychology and emotion equally important in demonstrating the risks and burdens of screening and treatment?
Yes, as I said too briefly, I rushed through them at the last couple slides. I think we can frame the choices about screening. Let's just take screening for the moment. Using our understanding of the psychology of control, using our understanding of the psychology of loss aversion. See those factors, right? So if you told a person, I had a person the other day, a friend of mine, who was she thinks environmental carcinogens are the biggest boogeyman. She opposes nuclear power. She's that kind of bent. And she said, thanks. Now I realize that there are harms from mammography. I'm rethinking whether to have it. Because I emphasized the loss aversion part of her emotional conversation. Yeah, right? So I understand that raising that part of the conversation in her head, right? There's this seesaw, should I or shouldn't I, right? I put a weight on the side of just using the facts, not lying, not being manipulative, but knowing that that's going to shape her choice environment. I added loss aversion to her critical thinking conversation. That's one quick example. And as I mentioned in one of my earlier slides, the same thing with how do I treat an overdiagnosed case? As I say in my book, I interviewed people, a good friend of mine, who wanted to take control, but saw ongoing monitoring as control. We can add that control language to when doctors talk about you can either do surgery or, right? And Adding that psychological filter in answering the person's question changes the lenses through which the information the doctor's presenting will be interpreted by the patient. So yes, I think these are tools by which we can have an impact.
Great, thank you. The next question relates to a comment that you made about informed consent. So you said the question is, how do we build informed consent for screening when clinicians struggle to meet the needs of their patients in primary care?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. There's a chapter in my book about helping people make more critical decisions, Stephen, your question earlier. And I know the informed consent and shared decision-making aids movement has created a lot of tools. And I did read and wrote in the book research that says doctors don't use a lot of them because they say they're not compensated for the time it takes. Yeah. So if we could make the case to insurers, and this is very theoretical by a journalist, so forgive me if it's naive, that it will save them money to build in a requirement that when they recommend screening, let's just take screening, let's just take mammography or PSA testing. When they recommend it, they have to prove with some sort of document or form or whatever that they've either had a conversation with or shown a form to that has been pre-approved by everybody that shows the benefits and the risks of those choices. That informed consent can be built into the process of medicine at the general practitioner level on the recommendation point of screening, not when the person goes to the clinic or whatever. Let's take PSA, for example, is a great example. So PSA is just a blood test. It's cheap and easy. I go in for my annual physical. The doctor runs my blood. She happens to run a PSA test too. She never even talks to me about it. Back comes a 4.2, and all of a sudden cancer's in the conversation. I haven't had a word to say about that. That's just plain wrong. So I believe there is a good argument to be made, and for the financial interests here, to build informed consent in more as a step to screening choices, and certainly to the how to respond to what the treatment options are for overdiagnosed cases. And there specifically, let me mention DCIS, because it's my understanding that still the breast cancer oncology world requires that the standard response to a DCIS diagnosis, regardless of the grade, is surgery, lumpectomy or mastectomy. Some doctors say we could also watch and wait because it's low grade and DCIS is a low risk and so forth. But legally, they can't offer that choice the way doctors can with PSA, right? Because that field, urology, is convinced that the mortality outcomes will be equal with either ongoing monitoring or immediate surgery. At that point, that conversation with the woman, I think having a more required informed consent that has all of the details, Stephen, your critical question, your question about critical thinking, they can't think critically if they don't have all the elements on the table. And I believe that building informed consent in as more of a requirement in the medical system will appeal to people publicly because they want the empowerment of knowing what's going on with their own bodies, will appeal to insurance companies, and is a way to get at this.
Okay, very good. Very hopeful. Thank you.
Perhaps
we have time for one more.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So the last question is, hello, and thank you very much for the session today. Could you please comment on the Choosing Wisely campaign that's led by the American College of Internal Medicine? I believe Choosing Wisely has also been supported by the organization that published the Consumer Reports magazine. Thank you again. Bravo.
Yay, thank you for all your thank yous. Yeah, Choosing Wisely is this informed consent thing. And I talked to, was the foundation that supported them in Philadelphia? I can't remember the name of the fellow I talked to as part
American
of it.
College. Yeah, American College of, I think it's the American College of the ACP, I think.
Okay, there was someone from the Choosing Wisely movement who I interviewed as part of the research for the book. And you can't be wise if you don't have all the information. And we're back to the conversation about informed consent. So my comment about choosing wisely and shared decision-making aids and all of that, of which that's the last chapter in the book, is how people individually can make better critical decisions, is that there are all these tools out there. We need to use them more. Bravo to all of them. The problem appears to be, as I read the research that I came across, doctors say they're not compensated for the time it takes to do all this stuff to get it into people's heads. But there's a second problem. This just came to mind. There's a lot of research that says that doctors promote what they want to promote. Yeah? So that's the economic argument, right? You make more money by doing a biopsy than not doing a biopsy. You make more money when you do a colonoscopy if you remove something rather than just looking, right? There's an economic incentive. But beyond that, a lot of doctors say, and I can't remember the exact citation, but I can share it with this person later if you want. It's in the book. We are trained to do stuff. This is almost literally what the doctor said. And just watchful waiting or not screening doesn't feel like doing stuff. Also, many doctors have cancer in their personal experience that overweights their personal choices. Urologists are much more likely to do PSA testing on themselves, knowing all of the flaws of that test, than GPs are. And cancer doctors, and I have friends out there who I talk to for the book, they've devoted their lives to saving people's lives from this terrible, terrible, terrible disease. So when you talk about taking the C word out of the diagnosis of DCIS or low-risk prostate cancer, and the doctors who are against that say, yeah, but somebody might not be scared into maximal treatment and ultimately die of cancer. And they prioritize that over the harms that would come from the overtreatment. That's because their worldview has been devoted to saving these lives. And all of those are impediments to using the choosing wisely and shared decision-making aid tools, cultural impediments that need to be understood and more openly discussed within the medical field, I think.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I just want to clarify, I misspoke. It's the American Board of Internal Medicine that is behind the Choosing Wisely campaign. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time now. So, David, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank everyone for the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. And before we end, I just want to remind everyone that the next in-person Preventing Overdiagnosis meeting is going to be in September 2025 in Oxford. So I hope to see you all there.
You know, all the theater shows, people in Oxford, there's people, they get whacked all over the place, everywhere. So just be careful. Let me just add very quickly, Stephen, thank you again, Barry, and you for the invitation. And the questions that didn't get answered here, I'm more than happy to take online or however and continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Stephen. And again, thanks to Ruth, to Joanna, and to all of the attendees. Ruth, are we ending the session now? Ruth, you're on mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you now. You were
Sorry,
on mute.
Barry. I think David's left already.
Yeah, I don't see him.
No, I think David signed off.
Okay. I'm going to dial you up separately.
Dial
I'll call you back in a second.
me or Stephen?
Both of you.
Okay, so what am I supposed to do? Because I'm on a computer.
Just hang up.
Hang up?
Okay,
Okay.
Yeah.
bye.
See ya.